We only reconnected about 5 years ago when he came down for Friedman.
Oh, and we're live. So I'll do a short intro in Greek and then we'll start talking.
Okay.
Καλησπέρα. Γραμμή του Πυρός. Σήμερα έχουμε μια ειδική γραμμή του Πυρός, θα είναι στα αγγλικά. Έχουμε καλεσμένη μαζί μας μια αρχαιολόγο, την Louise Hitchcock, η οποία παράλληλα είναι και μέρος του φιλελεύθερου παύλα libertarian κινήματος στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες. Η Louise έχει μια μακρά ιστορία στα libertarian politics. Libertarian, για όσους γνωρίζετε και παρακολουθείτε, είναι, πώς να το πούμε, κάπως η πιο ορθόδοξη φιλελεύθερη πολιτική κίνηση των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών. Κατά κάποιους ακραία, κατά κάποιους αυτονόητη, και παράλληλα είναι αρχαιολόγος η οποία είναι στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Μελβούρνης και έχει συμμετάσχει σε αρχαιολογικές εξκαφές και στη χώρα μας με ειδίκευση στον πολιτισμό του Αιγαίου και τον αιγαιοπελαγίτικο πολιτισμό. Louise, I just had a brief intro.
Yeah,
welcome.
I understood a lot of it.
I'm sure you did. Welcome to ΚΕΦίΜ. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. For us, you know, this show is called Firing Line in Greek.
Like Buckley.
Like Buckley, yeah. Usually we try, and in the future we will have more confrontational, guests and discussions where we aim to dig deeper into the ideas of freedom and offer to the ΚΕΦίΜ audience some quality debates. But, even Buckley himself didn't have always people who were described as opponents of his ideas. So today, since you were in Athens, I thought it would be a great opportunity for people to find out a little more about a libertarian Indiana Jones, which is the way I view you. So I want to welcome you. This is your first time at ΚΕΦίΜ, at our headquarters. Although you have been last year a participant in one of our international conferences with the Coalition Leaders Forum and the Taxpayer Advocacy gathering that we had here in Athens. But first of all, welcome to Greece, welcome to Athens, and tell us what you've been working on lately.
Thank you. Alex, it's always a pleasure to be back. I spent 3 years here as a student working on my PhD on the Minoan palaces in the early 90s, and I come back semi-regularly to do all sorts of things. This year, I was working with 3 colleagues in Sparta. We had a survey near the Vaphio-Tholos tomb a couple of years ago, and what a survey means, it's what we call non-destructive archaeology. You walk along a gridded path and you collect artifacts from the surface, and you map in where those are. And we finished that survey in 2017. And then this year we began the first of what are 3 study seasons where those artifacts are cleaned and we enter them into a database to see where we have maybe the most late Mycenaean finds, the most Byzantine finds, the most early Bronze Age Greek finds. That would be in the 3rd millennium from 3000 to 2000 BCE. And then eventually we will publish what we learned from studying this data. And then here
this brings up a very interesting question to me because as I'm sure you know, in Greece, any rock you lift, you probably will find something. Well, more or less. We have so many thousands of years of history and, habitations and cities and smaller cities and villages and all that. During the ancient times, the Roman times, the Byzantine times, the Ottoman times. So the way you described what a survey is just brought in a question to me. So all you do is you walk around a specific area of Sparta and you find on the surface...
It's actually south of Sparta. And we just don't walk around. It's very systematic in that we have grid squares laid out. And we walk the grid squares systematically. And after we finish each one, we stop and record what we've collected.
Yeah, but how do you find the things?
How do we know there's a site there?
Yeah.
Okay, because there have been earlier surveys in the 1950s. 2 British archaeologists Richard Hope Simpson and Helen Waterhouse did a walk through the whole area and recorded that they found pottery in that area. But even more important,
and they find it in the surface.
Yeah,
on the surface?
Yeah, right on the surface. But even what's more important is that there's an important early monument there, the Vaphio Tholos tomb. It's one of the earliest Tholos tombs in Greece. And the tomb itself there's not much to see with it, in that because it was one of the earliest, it was built freestanding. Because it was built freestanding, the beehive shape of the tomb collapsed in. And so it's not very pretty to look at, but it was one of the few unplundered Tholos tombs that's been excavated. And it was the site where they found the famous gold Vaphio cups that are in the National Museum of Athens, that show a scene of Minoan bull leaping and bull capturing, and also a set of scale weights, which means that the owner was probably an early wealthy merchant who was advertising his wealth. There had also been some minor excavation taken place by the Greek Archaeological Service on the associated Mycenaean site of Vaphio Paleopyrgi. And before we decided to apply to undertake the survey, we were walking around the area and found a Mycenaean quarry right on the surface. And we got a permit to study that, and we published it in 2016.
How easy was it to get a permit?
Well, it took us 5 years. And I had a chance, actually, being part of the Australian system, to get a large government grant to work here in Greece, but I couldn't find a willing collaborator. And I found one right away in Israel. And in the 5 years we were waiting for our permit, I literally published dozens of articles on the site I work in Israel, which is a Philistine site. A lot of people believe the Philistines came from Greece at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. And so it's actually easier to study Aegean Greek archaeology, that is prehistoric Greek archaeology, outside of the Aegean than inside. It's much easier
and that's because of government bureaucracy and the time it takes to get the permits, the licenses, or even find academic collaborators that are willing to share. Archaeology often tends to be, because it's rooted in the humanities, tends to be a very selfish enterprise. My Israeli collaborator is very generous in that we've published dozens of collaborative articles together. The last one had 16 co-authors, which is really probably the biggest collaborative article I worked on yet. But also, I would say in both instances, there's a bit of nationalism at play, in the sense that for the Israelis, it's a way to put give positive public relations to the state of Israel. With many Greeks, it's kind of a way of saying, this is our nation, you're our guest here, and you have to wait for us to decide when we will let you do something. Wow. All right, so this brings up a series of follow-up questions.
This is not going to be very popular with my Greek colleagues.
Are you? Well, we can avoid it if you want. We have other topics to talk about.
We'll sort of go.
Let me ask you. So, were ancient Greeks, as let's say, negatively predisposed to working with other people? For example, let me make this a specific question. So in all the excavations you've been a part of in Greece, have you found any Egyptian, objects that would signify that there was exchange of culture and civilizations and trade and all that?
I personally have not. However, I actually have an article coming out next year, which is based on my professorial lecture, which is on globalization and populism in the past and the present, and the Bronze Age, the period I work in, which is around 1900 BCE to 1200 BCE. There was a lot of travel around the Mediterranean, and the Minoans acquired Near Eastern ship technology by 1900 and used it to start acquiring exotic prestige goods, and also important things like metals, because Crete is sort of poor in both exotic raw materials and in things like copper, tin, gold. And so they were required to sail and trade and engage in a trade network to get these things. We also have early Greek texts written by the Mycenaeans in the linear, what's known as the linear B script, where you have loan words for spices imported from the east, such as sesame and coriander. So we know that this region was fully networked into the Mediterranean trading system by this time. It was a global, it was a globalized world.
And that would also lead to, and I know you've studied the presence of black minorities in the past in this part of the world as well. And it happens that today the most famous Athenian in the world is an African basketball player, a Greek basketball player whose family was from Nigeria, Giannis Antetokounmpo. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, I haven't.
He was the MVP of the NBA.
That's fantastic.
Actually. So he's considered to be probably, if not the best basketball player in the world right now, he's definitely up there. And his family were immigrants from Nigeria who came here, and Giannis and his brothers, who all represent the Greek national team in basketball, they are black Greeks. So what was the present like? Would you find this level of multiculturalism in those times?
I think you would. We have more representations of black people in Greece from the classical era, and then especially later in Rome, because as you probably know, Scipio Africanus was an African, I believe, emperor of Rome, and we have lots of representations of blacks. There's the famous horse rider in the National Museum, bronze horse rider group. But even in the Minoan era, there's a famous fresco that Evans called the Captain of the Blacks from Knossos. And it's very fragmentary, but it shows a man who's depicted in red pigment, and behind him there are the legs of what look to be black soldiers, maybe mercenaries. Ethiopian mercenaries and Nubian mercenaries, we know they were used throughout Egypt, and it's not unlikely some of them found their ways to Crete. And we also know that there are depictions of blue monkeys in the Theron frescoes that are vervets that would have come from Nubia, not necessarily directly, but maybe through Egypt. And so people were moving around, and one doesn't have to be black to be a person of color. You can just simply be Mediterranean and be brown, and people were interacting and staying places. We know from the Amarna texts of a trader, we don't know his nationality, but we know that he stopped in Egypt and remained for 6 years before moving on. And it's especially this maritime culture. This would have been in the Amarna letters is a period of King Akhenaten, so it would have been in the 14th century.
Mm-hmm. So there's a long tradition of cultural exchange,
yes,
trade, and all that in this part of the world, which one would argue this kind of culture took a heavy hit for about 2,000 years, and with all the trouble that comes with the Balkans, especially in this part of the world.
But at the same time, the Balkans was a source of a new type of, and Italy were the source of a new type of weaponry around 1200 BCE, and it's this new weaponry that led partly to the collapse of the Bronze Age. It was a type of cut and thrust sword that became very popular, and it kind of led to the overthrow of a lot of the palatial kingdoms of this era. The Mycenaeans, the trading city of Ugarit in Syria, the Hittites. Troy is a small part of it, although we tend to magnify it in our own minds because it's an important part of the canon of so-called Western civilization. But it was this kind of weaponry actually came out of, and warrior ethos that came out of that region. So, and even though it's seen as a terrible period of collapse that ended this great era of great kings and globalization, the collapse in a way was necessary to create the resilience that gave birth to the Greek polis, the Israelite cultures, the Hellenization of Cyprus, the Phoenicians. So a lot of positive things eventually emerged out of collapse. We always tend to think of collapse in terms of its negative outcomes, but there are also positive ones as well. You create unintended consequences, and you create a new, more resilient system.
Yeah, and so as we move through time, and which era is the one that you have mostly focused professionally?
1700 to about 1000 BCE. I started out with the Minoan palaces and the function of the Minoan palaces and the architecture on Santorini and Thera, and also our survey on up near Sparta, but also looking at Philistine identity and its Aegean connections, which is very important to the 12th and 13th century.
Tell us about that. It's something I've never heard about.
And one other thing I'll quickly mention is I've started recently looking westward in Sicily and Sardinia. So looking at what's going on in the Mediterranean islands and keeping them stable. Well, there's a belief that with this destruction that happens in the 12th century BCE, that there were people known as they're so-called sea peoples. This is a modern term for them. It's like saying Europeans. Saying sea peoples doesn't really tell us who they are. And it used to be thought that this represented a big colonizing movement of Mycenaean elites going from Greece to the Philistine world. Although why would you leave Greece to go to the Levant if you were in good shape? It's more thought that we've recently written 4 or 5 articles on the sea people as pirates that coalesce their identity around Greek-style drinking ceremonies, such as consumption of wine, and but we're drawn from a lot of different maritime cultures, stretching from Sardinia to Crete to Mycenae to Cyprus to Anatolia, because we see minor aspects of all these different cultures in the material culture of the Philistines. So it's very much what we would call a transnational or entangled culture. And the Philistines tend to get a bad rap in the Bible. They're seen as the pagan enemies of the God-loving Israelites. However, back then everybody was pagan, and the demonization of the Philistines, it serves an ideological purpose to create a prestigious and a cohesive Israelite identity. And in fact, the Philistines introduced into the region their art in the form of nice decorated style Mycenaean pottery, hydraulic cement, which we discovered at Tel Asafi, where I work and published, and iron working technology, a new technology. What happens to counter this new cut and thrust sword at the end of the Bronze Age is that iron is developed. Mm-hmm. And this iron technology gives rise to newer and better weapons. And in fact, it's the Israelites who lived in, they were sort of shepherds living in the hill country that were kind of the country bumpkins of the era.
Very interesting. And you have been able to work in Israel on excavations or like surveys and all that?
I worked on one project that's been going on for 20 years. I worked there for 10 years. My period there kind of ended 2 years ago when the upper part of the site was shut down. One of my former students, who's now my colleague, is there now with a small team of students working, and we may go back, but they're working in the later areas around the 9th century. For me, that's kind of the modern period.
One of the things that I've always wanted to discuss with archaeologists is this. So when you compare Athens to Rome, right? Mm-hmm. Besides the fact that the Roman antiquities have been better preserved, one of the things is, like, for example, the Parthenon, right? It hasn't been restored. It's like, it doesn't look like it looked back in the day, or not even close.
Well, it actually looked like it looked back in the day a couple of 100 years ago when it was a powder store and then it was fired upon. We have actually pictures of what it looked like, but they've been restoring those buildings since I was a student here 30 years ago.
Yeah.
No further comment.
But, yeah, all right. We're getting into the dangerous collegial territory. Are there different schools of thought on how to treat antiquities within the context of a society in a given time?
Oh, yeah. Actually, most projects now have to have a conservator who will treat fragile artifacts. And maybe one of the detriments to the Acropolis, because it's an open air site, is that 30 years ago when leaded gas was being used in Athens, the pollution was becoming embedded into the marble, and you couldn't scrub it away without scrubbing the marble away. And it was also doing great harm to the people. I remember my asthma became worse there. I remember you could walk across Athens and blow your nose and black stuff would come out. But today, most projects have to have a conservator who can treat special finds, such as an ivory object. For example, if an ivory object or some kind of organic object is in the ground, its chemistry has been modified by being in the damp soil. And if you take it out of that quickly, it becomes like a fish that you take out of the water. It would just flop around, or in the case of let's say the ivory object, it would just crumble into bits. So you have to treat it very carefully. And smaller finds often tend to get a lot of attention. And I would say that the austerity moves in Greece have done a lot to harm the conservation of Greek antiquities, in the sense that Santorini, or ancient Thera, has a very important site, Akrotiri, which was destroyed in an earthquake around 1614 BCE. And it's basically the Pompeii of the Aegean Bronze Age, with houses preserved to the second and third story. And it's also got very good preservation of their fresco paintings as a result. And a few years ago, they had to let go their entire conservation crew that was working on the frescoes because of money, because of the austerity program. And I was talking to the excavator, and he was very unhappy about this. And I said, well, you'll get a new crew, and it'll happen again and everything. But he emphasized to me that the point was, these people had 20 years of experience working on this particular group of frescoes. And so to have to train a new group would bring its own set of
this
problems.
Leads me to the next point, where your philosophy, our philosophy, individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, they mix in with archaeology a little bit. So question number one, just from the story you said about Akrotiri, and it so happens that I've been to Akrotiri in Santorini for the past couple of years straight. I've visited twice in 2 years. It's a wonderful, it's an awe-inspiring monument of humanity, right? You said it's the Greek Pompeii. So question number one, they needed money. They get thousands and thousands of tourists, wealthy American tourists and Australian tourists and Greek tourists of wealth and means. Isn't there a place where the private market can support archaeology? At least in Greece, that's not something very usual. We have a pretty much government-mandated, top-down approach to archaeology, and many would argue, even, true liberals at heart would say, that's fine. We don't want the private business to get immersed in the archaeological stuff, because all it takes is one short-term profit-seeking entrepreneur, and suddenly the damage to civilization and history could be enormous. So, what do you think? You're involved in a field where government plays an important role worldwide. Fair enough to say?
Yeah, but different governments.
Yes, different governments.
Not one government, and in a sense that could be part of the problem.
So there can be good governance of archaeological treasures and monuments and all that.
There can be. There can also be bad governments. There can also be obstructive governments. And I don't know the specifics of how the Akrotiri excavation is run, although the excavation permit is undertaken through the University of Athens. And I do know there's a private Thera foundation that people can presumably go to. However, the administration of archaeological sites is, I believe, undertaken by the Ephoria. And they, I believe, collect the entry fees and things like that, and maintain or don't maintain the sites, as the case may be. But I want to mention one other thing. Whereas small finds tend to get a lot of attention, it's like you can sort of guard that 10,000th loom weight or pot, but architectural monuments, many of them are one-of-a-kind masterpieces, and they're left exposed to the elements, and it's actually getting to the point where in another generation it may not be possible for somebody to come in, a graduate student to come in and say, Hitchcock was all wrong on the Minoan palaces, I'm going to do a better job, but the remains will be too crumbled.
So it's like the end of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
or the end of primary knowledge.
Yeah.
There'll be secondary knowledge, and there'll be Assassin's Creed, and
yeah. Wow, that's interesting. So,
can I just add one thing
Yeah.
there with Assassin's Creed? A student of mine's doing her honors thesis on it, and I was surprised to find out when I was in Sparta that the Chaotis Cave, a really minor site I went to as a student where the Spartans used to dispose of their undesirables, is now a major spot on the tourist site because it's featured in Assassin's Creed.
yeah, and it's stuff like that, like, for example, for those who don't know, Assassin's Creed is one of the best-selling video games in the world, and the last edition, I think, was called Odyssey, and it involved in the Greek world. And one could think that from a tourist perspective, Greece could be doing more in order to advertise and attract more tourists to more antiquities than the Parthenon, and a few more that everybody knows, like Knossos Palace and all that.
Yeah, well, that's part of it is the way the tourist industry operates. Knossos is the second most visited site in Greece after the Acropolis, and a lot of that has to do with the way the cruise ships come in every Tuesday, and that's when you get the most visits to the site, as well as tourists have caused great damage to the site, and large parts of it I used to be able to wander through as a student are now completely roped off.
Really? So where do you find a balance between people who want to experience ancient culture and people who can derive meaningful knowledge from it, like you? So I am the consumer of, okay, I went there, I bought a ticket, I went through, I gazed at the wonderful palace, I said, oh my God, this is amazing. I took my selfie, I took my photo, I took maybe a book on my way out. I'll always remember it. I'm not sure what I'll remember. I don't fully understand or grasp, for the most people, right? They don't fully understand or grasp the significance in terms of architecture, of culture, civilization, and all that.
It doesn't help that it's heavily reconstructed. It's been called some of the best Art Deco architecture in Greece because of Evans' reconstructions, but those also are now monuments to the past, to the history of Aegean archaeology, and they are also crumbling under the tourist footprint. But you could put walkways, which they've tried to do. Also, I don't think tourists come away with a very good, a very realistic impression of Minoan civilization from visiting Knossos. I've sat and listened to tour guides and sort of the tales they spin, and it's kind of told me that if I ever go to a place like the Aztec world or the Incan world, I would never trust a tour guide because they tend to tell a really sort of a fairy story, and it's very condescending.
Yeah.
And I think you can tell people.
I'm glad you're mentioning this.
I think you can present an accessible history and even prehistory to people without telling them a bunch of stories about King Minos and Ariadne and the Minotaur. I mean, there are always people that are going to want to consume something like that, but there are also people that really do want to learn and are educated, and I find these kinds of things very, very condescending to the tourists.
So then this brings something that I've realized, because, you know, as a think tank, whenever we have like important guests, for example, a few years back, we hosted Senator Rand Paul in Athens. So
I won't hold that against you.
Well, fair enough.
I actually re-registered Republican for one day to vote for Rand Paul, and he dropped out of the primary, but he's become too much of a Trumpist now for me.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I'm definitely, personally, as someone who has been involved in U.S. politics, I worked for Rand's dad's campaign back in 2012
Yep.
and all that. Yeah, I'm not no Trump supporters here, but in any case, we went to the Parthenon, to the Acropolis, and had a tour. And the first thing I realized was that even in English, when it's, you know, tourists who are, or foreigners who are being guided through the monument, the whole narrative of the Greek tour guides is very nationalist.
Yeah, we found that out last year.
And condescending. And the second thing is that, you know, we were together with a university professor who dared to point out at the Herodian and explain something about it. And then a tour guide passed by and said, "Are you certified to be able to describe things here? Because only if you're a registered tour guide you can do that." So what about that? How does that, first of all, is it something uniquely Greek? or have you seen it similar things in Israel or Italy or, you know?
Well, in Israel, I have a friend who's a PhD who's also a licensed tour guide, and they have to go through a very rigorous set of tests.
Theoretically, they do the same here too.
Yeah, but that was the case when I was a student here as well, and I can sort of understand. But the way we used to get around that, we did a series of 4 10-day study trips around Greece, where we go from dawn till dusk, visiting sites and museums, and everyone had to do a site report, but we would do it outside the site and then go in and look around at what was talked about to get around that sort of licensed tour guide thing. Israel comes with its own set of problems in that it heavily reconstructs many, many monuments to where you can't tell the difference between what's real and reconstructed. It's kind of a biblical Disneyland advancing Israeli nationalism.
Yeah. All right. So it's not a uniquely Greek phenomenon to add like the national narrative.
Have the nationalist narrative, yeah. It's unfortunate though.
Yeah. And I think people should have the choice, even between the tourist who wants to hear about the Minotaur, or the tourist who wants to hear about how this fresco was influenced by the Egyptian culture and because of trade, and dig deeper into the sociological or economic phenomena of the time.
We would call that a postmodernist approach, giving competing narratives. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with postmodernism. I found that lately a lot of people on the right, or even libertarians who aren't really libertarians, they will often paint academics as, postmodern postmodern left-wing Marxist feminists. And I would say that describes very few academics. But postmodernism itself is not an evil tool of the left. It's just a way of closely reading, putting out competing narratives, letting people make their choice. And it's only got this sort of association with the left, but there's no reason that anybody from any political persuasion can't utilize it.
I mean, from that perspective, one could say that truthiness or alternative facts is the right-wing version of it.
Yeah. Except I don't think alternative facts is the same as an alternative narrative, because a narrative can sort of stand or fall, and alternative facts are put out as a truth that isn't really the truth.
That's fair enough. But, the left does that too.
We like to say as archaeologists that we have this material culture, and those are the facts. And you can tell stories about them, but at the end of the day, you have to come back to the facts, and those anchor you.
As long as you're anchored to the facts, then, And after all, it's a competition in the realm of ideas, right?
Exactly.
Which one do you want?
Exactly. It's kind of like a practical philosophy, in that you're using material culture and using philosophical ideas to try to come up with the best way of reconstructing the past.
As a libertarian, in the whole experience of doing digs in Greece and being involved in Greek archaeology and all that, have you ever felt that you found something that was meaningful to you from an ideas perspective, from in relative to your libertarian principles and values?
Not so much early on. At the time when I started, I was trying to escape the present by going into the past. And then I realized that the past and present sort of co-construct each other. And now since I've been getting interested in things like trade and globalization, maritime interaction, I've thought about things like how capital moves around. It's moved around a lot by piracy, which is bad in that it's destructive, but at the same time, it does move capital around, and so does trade. And people were one of the things that drove trade far back as the Neolithic, when people were traveling around the Mediterranean in longboats, was the quest for metals. And before we had coinage, we had various hard currencies and mediums of exchange. Bronze, copper, and tin were one of the two foremost, but also exotic goods like ivory. And if you think of what it would take to get your hands on some ivory, you would have to be able to mount an elephant hunt, and that would take a lot of resources. And so ivory,
or know where elephants go to die.
Yeah, but it would have to be in Africa, and you would trade that. And ivory kind of became one of the ultimate transnational artifacts in that it was small, and you could display it to your retinue as a king and gain status from it. And it would often be handed down generations and even recut. And it was treasured because of its translucent power. It's mentioned both in Homer and in the Old Testament for its sort of translucent qualities. And other things like spices. When I worked in Syria, one of the first digs I worked on as a student, we had, it was an 18th century BCE site, and I didn't find it, but they had found a clove at the site. You think, oh, clove, what big deal? Cloves only came from Indonesia at that time. And it doesn't mean they were trading directly at Indonesia, but you had all this down the line trade. And spices are something that could be kept quite a while. They were small, they would fit in your pocket, and things like saffron, which was very much a part of Minoan culture and used in dyeing textiles, things like that would have also had probably been exchanged like a currency.
So through most of the relevant to your ideas findings that you've had or you've come across.
Yep.
They more have to do with trade and the movement of capital and goods.
Well, that's interesting to me, but it wasn't what I started out in. I started out wanting to know the function of the Minoan palaces and monumental architecture, and I think what I've always been interested in is space, because space kind of defines our routine. For example, you come to this building so many times a week, and you go to use certain rooms, and your daily routine is governed by the spaces you use. And I was interested in that from the standpoint of the Minoan palaces because of their complex and labyrinthine layout, but also in looking at maritime space, it's just a bigger space. And it also played a major role in creating people's identity. It was like, people often used to have this view of islands that they're these isolated laboratories that you could go to and things would be pristine and untouched. But in fact, islands and coastal areas were the most networked. And the sort of model of the network, which you could compare to the internet as a network, terrorism as a network, there's no center. There are just lots of connected nodes. And the sea was very instrumental in bringing all these regions together and creating trade. And recently I've read where the way to ensure the survival of capitalism is through free trade and sharing and making sure everybody's prosperous through participating in this system. Well, this was also how islands maintained their security, was through participating in this system and having something that somebody else would trade with. And I just made my first trip to Sardinia last year, which is an extraordinary place. It's got 8,000 Bronze Age sites. And it's a little island, and that's just the ones they've discovered. And so you would have these sort of nodes, and the island would be this just interconnected network of continuing nodes, and that would have contributed to their security, but they were also outward looking. They had obsidian to trade, which is also still important. It's used in surgeries, and metals, and they had far-flung relations with Cyprus. And other places that were a bit more isolated, like Rhodes, got sort of desolated through piracy. So having trade and exchange networks, it not only created prosperity, but it also created security.
That's a very interesting take on that. And one of the key questions that before we wrap up, because we've passed a little bit the 30-minute mark, but this has been very interesting to me, and I'm sure that for everybody who's watching, it's also interesting. Questions that Greeks want to ask, right? So I've talked with a few of my colleagues and some of our ΚΕΦίΜ members. What would they ask you? The first question that most of them mentioned was, do you think that it would be appealing to Americans or Australians, because those are you're American who you're a teacher in Australia, right?
Yes.
So
a professor.
a professor.
It's okay.
Do you think that it would be fair to say that people who study archaeology, especially, there's a lot who are studying Greek-related themes, they would be interested to attend or would like to have an easier way to go to school here to study at a Greek university or a foreign university in Greece, a private probably university maybe. Do you think this is a wasted opportunity, the fact that our constitution mandates
You mean for Greeks or for foreigners?
for foreigners to come and study here?
It already exists in a sense in that there are a number of foreign schools here that are responsible for allocating permits to do research. The American School of Classical Studies, where I spent 3 years, it's the largest privately funded educational institute outside the US. And then most of the other foreign schools are funded by their government to one extent or another. There's a tiny Australian institute, which is where I'm staying right now. There's a British School of Archaeology. So there are all these foreign institutes, and they tend to have full year-long programs for graduate students. And then you have sort of summer programs for undergraduate students. And there's also a program called College Year in Athens, which has a year-long program for U.S. undergraduate students. Now, to go to a Greek university, that would mean having to function in modern Greek. And some people do it, and some people don't.
Not necessarily. In the way it is right now, it would mean that, but...
let me just finish. You do have MA programs at Tel Aviv University, and I believe also at Louvain-la-Neuve, where there are master's programs in English that put you through a set program. And a lot of these programs are set up to make money, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but what they give the student, the quality can vary. I think these two programs are very good, but there are a number of fee-paying programs where the main objective is to earn money and not to necessarily educate. So if the right type of program was set up, I think it would be interesting, but you could also have just briefer study trips for educated adults. And I know, like, the Australian Institute has a group of friends here, and they take them on outings, and presumably the friends give tokens of their friendship in exchange. But there are lots of things actually already going on in Greece. It's just a question of becoming aware of them.
And it's also a question of, because higher education in Greece is a government monopoly, many Greeks...
It is in Australia as well. Very different from the US.
There are no non-profit universities?
They're non-profit, but they're all government run.
They're all government run?
Yeah, and in fact, when I started there 15 years ago, I asked my boss about philanthropy, and he said, we don't do that in Australia. Now that's starting to change, where the government-run universities are seeking private philanthropy. And we had our recent chair of classics funded by the Greek community. And that's now a named chair. And another foundation gave $20 million to the school I teach in, the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. And it was the largest single philanthropic donation by a private individual to an Australian university. But then you have other sort of policy think tanks like Manukau, which seems rather good. And then you have this attempt to create a Ramsey Center for Western Civilization, which has not gained much traction with the academic community because of the whole emphasis on Western civilization, because Western civilization doesn't start in the West, it starts in the East. And so it's seen as rather exclusionary. I mean, my personal feeling is if you're going to critique Western civilization, you have to know about it. However, if you're going to do Western civilization, you have to realize it also doesn't start in the West.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that when Greeks say that, or others say that Greece is the birthplace of Western civilization, do you think that's accurate?
No. Because I started out wanting to do classical archaeology. I did my BA in political theory and philosophy and studied Plato and Aristotle and had this idea of the Greeks as rational and logical. And then I came here as a graduate student and learned about the cult of Dionysus and the cult of Asclepius, where you sleep in a room with a snake, and Dionysus, where you tear up a little animal and get really drunk, and realized that I was getting a very skewed view of Greece. And also I started out, I ended up doing my MA in the history of the ancient Near East because I wasn't very sophisticated as a student. I wasn't a good consumer. And the only excavation they had going out of UCLA, which was the closest university to where I lived, was in Syria. And that gave me a completely different perspective. And I lost interest in classical archaeology. It just seemed too modern, and got interested in the Bronze Age and what people were able to achieve. And you had astronomy and astrology and great building methods and maritime sophistication. And it's just not possible that Greece is the pure fount of Western civilization. It didn't spring fully developed like Athena from the head of Zeus. It had a long gestation period prior and was influenced by many outside cultures.
Well, Louise, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure having you, and keep rocking and keep spreading the knowledge and keep digging Greece to find more of our ancient heritage in Sparta and the Aegean and everywhere else. I hope that the Greek government is going to make your job easier now in the future. There has been a change in government. What have you heard about that, by the way?
Nothing. I mean, just that it's a change in government. I did meet the new mayor of Sparta. He's very impressive.
Oh, he's a member of our board. Petros Doukas, the mayor of Sparta, member of the ΚΕΦίΜ board.
I'm very optimistic that things will improve for Greece, and you keep reminding everybody how Tax Liberation Day is earlier and earlier in the year, and I think that's also very good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Γραμμή του Πυρός την επόμενη Πέμπτη. Θα είμαστε κοντά σας. Την επόμενη Πέμπτη έχω το αίσθημα, την προαίσθηση ότι θα φύγουμε πάλι από τα πολιτικά και θα κοιτάξουμε να ασχοληθούμε λίγο με τον κόσμο των επιχειρήσεων. Θα τα πούμε την επόμενη Πέμπτη. Γεια σας.
Thank you.
The